Welcome back. This is our second podcast for the LGR series. I'm once again joined by Oliver Deeds. I promise he's not our only guest, but I thank him for coming
Yes, I
back
am. Yes, I am.
for stepping in at short notice to someone that couldn't attend. So last week, we're going to continue the themes from that. Last week, we discussed about LGR, devolution, and how the program's going overall. But this week, we want to touch more on planning and the implications in the planning system, because I think planning is one of those things that touches most people's lives most directly on a daily basis. It's the one thing that really makes a local authority present to residents. So I suppose the one very easy question to answer: what's the impact on planning with LGR?
Well, I would say in the first instance, there's going to be quite short-term disruption. So in the first instance, as with any organisational change, there is likely to be a bit of churn in staff. So people might move on. People that stay within local authority environments are going to be wondering what's going to go on, what their future looks like. So more energy is going to be spent on that than it is currently, which is going to gobble up energy and time that could be spent on determining planning applications or setting policy. I think it will have an impact in terms of there are going to be new committee structures that are put in place eventually. There are going to be new councillors that are going to need training. There's probably going to be a higher churn rate of councillors than there would have been had the sort of old structures stayed in place.
Let's jump in on that point, because I'm interested in exploring that. There are, X number of hundreds of councillors across Surrey. That's obviously going to be reduced to two councils, one of about 80 councillors, one of about 90. Do you think it will be new councillors, or do you think we're just going to get a recycling of existing councillors from those that exist? I mean, how many of them do you think will genuinely be new, or is it a question of, different wards, different boundaries will elect, people from very different viewpoints?
It's a very good question, and I'm not an expert on Surrey politics specifically. I would imagine that you will have the existing cadre of councillors applying for new seats, so there will still be some continuity, but also the politics now is very different in those locations to what it was the last time that these districts had elections. So I'd imagine you would see more, and you tell me you're much better at Surrey politics than I am. I'd imagine there'd be an influx potentially of reform councillors who are likely to be drawn from different places, but there will still be that retention of residents associations, residents groups. They're still going to have quite a big say in both of these local authorities moving forwards. But I would still imagine there's going to be a good amount of churn.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's probably going to be a big churn, and I think looking at larger ward boundaries here, some people have argued that, say, in East Surrey, where Elmbridge and Epsom and Ewell are quite resident association dominated, actually those voices might get mitigated out. But with the collapse nationally of, I think, trust and support for the major parties, actually there's a good opportunity for those groups to come through the middle. It does make the question of governance more difficult when you don't have a party structure, a party discipline to band together. But I guess Epsom and Ewell would disagree with me on that, because they've been running their council like that for quite some time. But going further then, we're moving away from a system in which actually councils are fairly close to their local communities. Awareness of councils, most people probably don't know who there is, in fairness, but is that not going to be exacerbated by having a council much higher level, with ward councils covering much larger areas, and all the divisions in Surrey, for example, will be 2 members, whereas at the moment they're smaller with 3 members typically. But is that being so? We're seeing in parts of Surrey the sudden rollout of parish and town councils. Take Guildford, for example, which is currently consulting on introducing a new town council for the area. Does that lead to unequal representation? So you'll have some parts of the new local authority areas with much more distant councillors and no local representation, and others that actually have both.
Well, there's 2 questions there. So the first is around, does unitary authority sort of sizes and structures mean that people are going to feel that their politicians are more remote? Probably, because the main interface that you have at the moment is presumably with your ward councillor. that ward council is going to have a higher workload just by virtue of the fact that they're covering a bigger area. So there's going to be a bit of an issue there, I would imagine, and it will be interesting to see how that unfolds. As to your question around Guildford, the potential for Guildford Town Council, one can't help but think that the creation of those types of structures is a mechanism by which existing councillors who might be out of jobs in a few months' time can create something for themselves to do, so that they. And I'm not coming at that from a sceptical perspective. I'm coming at that from the perspective of these people are civic minded. They want to stay involved in civic society, and they're sort of cultivating a way to do that. So, does that lead to unequal representation? Not any more so than the current situation, I would say.
So for developers, it's a little bit of a maelstrom of issues. So you've got the officer churn, which you've referred to, but there's also, as you say, the councillor churn. But you've got essentially, you've got old councils that will continue to be they'll be the primary decision makers. They're the statutory authorities for planning decisions for another 18 months at least, unless there's for some reason a delay, which there shouldn't be. But then you've got new councillors with more recent mandates who may have a say in applications. I mean, how much influence and recognition should developers be giving the new shadow authority versus the current existing authority? And is there a potential for significant conflicts between the old councils and the new councils?
I suppose it depends where your development is in the cycle. So, in the first instance, you have to assess who is likely to be determining that application. Is it going to be the shadow authority when it converts into being the full authority, or is it going to be determined by the existing district? So that probably determines what your approach is going to be. I think, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, the general advice would be that the new councillors that are elected to these shadow authorities are going to be important stakeholders in the process. So you need to bring them into the process as early as possible. Alighting on what you said earlier, there is probably going to be a crossover in terms of those people that are serving district councillors as well as those that are serving on the new shadow authority, I would imagine. So I think you just have to have very good stakeholder mapping at the outset of the process. You need to know which authority is likely to determine your scheme, which will depend on your own timescales, and adjust your approach accordingly, I would say.
I think it raises, two potentials. You might have those councillors that get elevated to a new shadow authority, and the ones left behind decide, do you know what? We'll take the hard decisions on planning. We'll make it easier for the new council and take those, take it to the team, as it were. Or alternatively, I guess you might get those councillors going, well, I haven't got a seat. I'm going to be out for at least 5 years. The new Surrey Council, Shadow Authority, and the Eventual Authority will have 5-year term in the first instance. They're going to be out for 5 years. There's no chance of a political comeback anytime soon. So why not make one last stand? Especially if the officer class are leaving the councils, maybe guidance is more difficult or things get a bit slower. It's easier, I guess, to reject things. It raises a couple of interesting points on that front. So on local plans, let's turn there, because that's obviously the guiding principle for how development is done. Now, there's some issues in some of the Surrey councils. So, for example, Elmbridge, the inspector threw out their local plan, so they're currently without one, meaning speculative development is high. They also have the issue that one of the boroughs has such a lack of a 5-year housing land supply that it will actually bring down the entire uh, east side Surrey. So, despite the fact that spatial development policies still will apply to individual geographical areas, the 5-year housing land supply will be judged across the entire local authority area. So does that mean areas like Elmbridge, which have a poor local plan or no local plan status essentially, and will be part of a new council that has a 5-year housing land supply issue, so the presumption of favour applies, does that mean that Elmbridge is going to get lumped with all the development going forwards until such time as the new local council puts a local plan together?
I don't know. It's never as simple as that, is it? It's because it's not just local plan status or 5-year land supply that drives investor and developer decisions. It's a whole group of other factors that are involved in this. So it's going to be interesting to see how that one pans out in the first couple of years. In terms of how quickly do the new authorities have to get their local plans in place?
5 years.
Okay,
That said, Bucks has for example, is the obvious example where that hasn't happened. They still haven't done theirs, and I think they're 7 years into unitarisation.
Right. Okay. So that's not a good precedent. I would say that if you're the if you're leading the new administrator, the new East Surrey or the new West Surrey administration, the first priority that you have is to get your local plan in place to affect. If you want to manage development in your area and you want to remove that presumption in favour of development, then you need to get that local plan in place as quickly as you possibly can, and that needs to be the number one priority of those new administrations.
And this really brings us to the next point, that the whole point of the Surrey LGR, so Tim Oliver, leader of Surrey, has been very clear when the proposal went in to Parliament at the Secretary of State for decision that they want a directly elected mayor, a mayoral combined authority with the powers to uh, undertake strategic planning locally at that level rather than coming from central government. There's an opportunity there, is there not, for developers really to get in on the ground now with, making themselves present and, respected by these local authorities to influence the shape of those spatial development strategies coming forwards and local plans. So what advice would you have for developers considering options? Because it's not just Surrey, obviously, it's so many other areas like Sussex and Essex coming forwards with these models, although obviously they've been delayed a little bit. What advice would you have for them? Or should they be really focusing their efforts on that more strategic layer, like in London, for example, with the mayor's extended emergency powers, determine applications between 50 and 150 units? Developers be doing the same now, making overtures to combined authorities.
I think it's not an either or approach. The reality is that the advice I would give developers at the moment is to review your portfolio, review this situation in all of the geographical areas that you're operating in, and then depending on the size of your scheme, if you have, say, large infrastructure asks associated with a project that you're bringing forward, you're probably going to be looking to the new combined authority, the new combined county authorities, whatever the organizational structure is, to help support you in finding the funding to unlock that particular piece of infrastructure. But if you're working on smaller schemes, you just need a really, really good understanding of what that new unitary authority is going to look like so that you can, adjust your strategy accordingly. So it depends on a few factors, but I would say it depends on the size of the scheme that you've got, the geographical area that's covered, and what your infrastructure asks are really. That should determine the approach that you take both to the strategic authority as well as the new unitaries.
Turning away from Surrey for a moment, and we're just using that as the case study because it's the first one to come up and of interest. Do you think actually outside of Surrey, so the other areas that will be coming forwards as part of the next round, so we're looking at Sussex, they know it's happening, they know it's coming, but they've got an extra year on top because obviously their shadow authorities aren't being elected until next May as part of the devolution priority programme areas. So those other areas, actually, we would always say, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we would always say never submit a planning application that's controversial during an election cycle, for example.
Yep.
It can be incredibly risky. You've got the chance of things becoming political footballs. Does that mean in these areas, and it's not practical to not put in applications, but in these areas, essentially, you're going to have 24 months or longer of basically being in a constant election period?
Yeah. And if at the margins, I think that will impact on the decisions that investors and developers make, particularly those that have got a portfolio of sites and can focus their energies in other areas rather than spend time in areas that have all of this political complexity going on. So it's going to be incumbent upon the existing districts and counties, as well as the new unitary authorities, to communicate to the market why your area is a particularly attractive proposition to invest in. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at, you talked about London earlier, and there might be some flux and there might be some change there. But politically, London looks like a relatively, after the local elections take place in 2026, it's a settled scenario in London for a period of time. So notwithstanding all of the other issues that you've got in that particular market, that's quite an attractive place to invest moving forwards. As is, lots of these authorities that have already got these, the combined counties, or the combined authorities like Greater Manchester, all the big cities, they become quite attractive places to invest because there's political certainty moving forward. So it'll be quite interesting to see how that unfolds over the next couple of years. Some local authority areas, I think, will see quite a significant decline in the applications that are submitted just because of that uncertainty at the moment.
Yeah, and we've seen that in areas like Bristol, where there's been huge amounts of investment from the private sector that's gone into housing and development, and that's being recycled back into the local community. I mean, at the moment as well, it's important, I think, for listeners to understand that it's not just the devolution priority areas coming forward. They're just the first batch, as it were. There's around 21 county councils that will be abolished by the end of this parliament, and 164 district councils from that. We're including areas that already have the unitary, so Berkshire, again, for example, or Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. It's also going through the process, as well as Gloucestershire, Derbyshire, Warwickshire, Worcestershire, the whole lot. It's a huge area. So if you don't think it affects you now, it will affect you going forwards. So I think it's definitely one to be aware of. We're coming towards the end of our time. Is there any other points on the community engagement side and how we're working with communities that you think, what's your final thought? What would you say to developers you must consider when approaching a planning application in an LGR area?
I mean, do your research, and if you're in the process of acquiring a site in one of these locations, when you're doing your viability assessment and you're doing your appraisal, you should really be seeking to understand what the long-term governance structure within that location is going to be, and how that might impact the way that you approach stakeholder engagement, community engagement. And also you should be undertaking a risk calculation as to whether you're likely to get a local consent or not. And that's going to become a more complex calculation as a result of all these changes. So research, get it done up front, and it will save you a lot of pain in the long term.
I think that's good advice. And I'd also add to that, to those that think, I'll just go to the Secretary of State to have it overruled. There's a very long wait to get onto that list. So local decisions are obviously easier and more cost effective for everyone. And I agree with Ollie that good community engagement can solve so many issues very quickly. If you can demonstrate support for your scheme, then it's an easy one for councillors to put through. So final questions, quick fire. Last week I asked you, would Andy Burnham ever be Prime Minister or replace Keir Starmer? Guessing we're still on the no bandwagon.
I think I got that one right. I'm not saying he will never be Prime Minister. He just won't replace Keir Starmer in this Parliament, in my view.
How about Angela Rayner? I've heard her name come back up since Andy Burnham's.
That's more likely. I'm not going. I tell you what, I'm not going to be drawn on it because I don't know, but that's more likely than Andy Burnham. Let's put it that way.
And it's something that Matt Masters on the Truth About Local Government asks me every time. On a score of 1 to 10, how is LGR going? What score are we giving Steve Reed this week? I think last time I spoke with Matt, I gave it an optimistic 7 because a lot of things are still on track. My concern is around the devolution aspects being deferred in places like Essex, because that's really important to the process. But what do you think? What's your score?
I think I'm optimistic about it. I'm quite supportive of it as an agenda. So I would fall in line and agree with you somewhere between a 7 and an 8, I would say. And okay, as we discussed last time, things have clearly come up that have pushed elections back and they've bitten off a little bit more than they can chew, but something needed to be done. So I'm optimistic, 7 or 8.
Great. I agree. I think that's sensible. So hopefully there's no U-turns on this one, and devolution and local government reorganisation continue at pace. Thank you everyone for listening once again. Next week we'll be back, probably with Ollie, but maybe a different guest. And in the meantime, keep on listening.